When I stepped into the Caldwell vineyard, it wasn't the vines or the sky that struck me. It was the silence, sharp, deliberate, appraising. No insults, no hostility, just careful smiles and polite questions that cut deeper than rudeness ever could. Within seconds, I understood the truth. I wasn't a guest. I was a test. And they had no idea who they were measuring. I learned very quickly that the Caldwell family didn't see themselves as rich. They saw themselves as established. Their vineyard wasn't flashy. No gold gates. No marble statues. Just acres of land that had been in the family for generations. Quiet confidence, and the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself because it already assumes it belongs there. People like the Caldwells don't ask where you're from out of curiosity. They ask to place you at dinner. Margaret Caldwell talked about logistics routes and distribution contracts the way other people talk about the weather. Lauren dropped names casually: senators, board members, judges, never explaining who they were, because in her world, you were supposed to already know. And then there was me. No one asked what I did for a living. They asked how I found Ethan, not what I worked on, but whether I had adjusted to the pace out here, not where I saw myself in 5 years, but whether I was comfortable being around people like them. It wasn't hostile. That's the part people don't understand. It was polite, controlled, almost kind. They had already decided I wasn't a threat. In their minds, I was temporary, a phase. Someone Ethan would outgrow once real responsibilities kicked in, and because they believed they were on higher ground, they spoke freely about the business, about expansion plans, about risks they assumed no one else at the table could possibly follow. Here's something most people never realize until it's too late. When you grow up protected by money, connections, and reputation, you learn how to use systems. But when you grow up without those things, you learn how to read them. You learn which rules are flexible and which ones aren't. You learn where people cut corners. You learn what gets documented and what conveniently doesn't, because you have to. For the Caldwells, the system had always worked. Permits got approved, shipments cleared customs, disputes settled quietly. They believed that meant they were smart. What they didn't see was that comfort had made them careless. They spoke in shorthand. They assumed understanding instead of verifying it. They talked like no one outside their circle had the patience or the background to connect the dots. That night, while Margaret explained a new distribution model to a guest from Napa, I noticed something small. The way she kept referring to a holding company instead of the operating entity, the way Lauren corrected her, too quickly, when she mentioned timelines. Tiny things. But systems are built on tiny things. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I listened. People often mistake silence for ignorance, especially when they think they're winning. What they don't realize is that silence is where patterns become visible. I saw how decisions flowed upward, but responsibility flowed downward. I saw which names were said with confidence and which ones were avoided. I saw how much depended on assumptions that had never been challenged because no one thought anyone like me would ever challenge them. Later that evening, Ethan squeezed my hand and whispered, "They just need time to get used to you." I smiled, because in that moment, I understood something he didn't. They weren't evaluating me. They were confirming their own beliefs, that people like them stayed on top because they deserved to. That people like me existed on the margins because we belonged there. And when you truly believe you're superior, you stop guarding the gates. That's the paradox no one talks about. Power doesn't make you sharper, it makes you comfortable. And comfort is what allows the most dangerous mistakes to go unnoticed. By the end of the night, they still saw me as an outsider, someone harmless, someone lucky to be there. What they didn't see, what they never even considered, was that I had already begun mapping the system they trusted blindly. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I was angry, but because when you've spent your life being underestimated, you learn one essential skill very early on. You don't survive by being louder. You survive by understanding exactly how things actually work. And once you understand that, everything else becomes a matter of timing. Ethan had a talent that everyone admired. He could make tension disappear without actually resolving it. Whenever the room felt tight, he'd step in with a smile, a hand on my back, a quiet joke meant to smooth the edges. He was good at that. Good at calming people down. Good at making things feel easier than they actually were. The first time his mother questioned my background a little too carefully, he squeezed my fingers under the table and said, "She just worries too much. It's not personal." The second time Lauren made a comment about how relationships change once real responsibilities start, he laughed it off and told me later, "She didn't mean you. She's just blunt." And every time I felt that small, uncomfortable tightening in my chest, Ethan had the same answer. "Give it time. They'll come around. It'll all work out." At first, I believed him. I wanted to. Ethan wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He never raised his voice or insulted me outright. In private, he was affectionate, attentive, almost apologetic about his family's behavior. He listened when I spoke. He nodded. He held me when I felt overwhelmed. But listening isn't the same as acting. 3 weeks after that first dinner, we were walking the vineyard at sunset. He talked about expansion plans, about how the business was entering a delicate phase, about how his parents had been under pressure for years. I asked him, carefully, whether he'd ever told them that I wasn't going anywhere. He stopped walking, thought for a moment, then said, "I don't think that conversation would help right now." That was the first time I noticed the pattern. Whenever I asked him to choose a side, he reframed it as bad timing. Whenever I asked for clarity, he offered patience instead. Whenever I needed him to draw a line, he asked me to understand why the line was complicated. He wasn't lying, not exactly. He just never told the whole truth. Ethan lived between two worlds, and he had learned how to survive there by never fully committing to either one. With me, he was gentle and reassuring. With his family, he was agreeable and careful. He never contradicted them directly, but he never defended me directly either. Standing in the middle gave him something valuable. It gave him options. At a charity dinner in San Francisco, his mother referred to me as Ethan's friend in front of a donor. Ethan corrected her later, quietly, in the car, not in the room. When I asked why he hadn't said anything at the table, he said, "That wasn't the moment. At a board-adjacent meeting I wasn't supposed to attend." Lauren asked him, half joking, whether I understood how serious things were getting. He laughed and said, "She knows enough. Enough. Not everything. Just enough." That word followed me everywhere. Enough to attend events, but not enough to be consulted. Enough to be present, but not enough to be acknowledged. Enough to matter emotionally, but not enough to matter strategically. Ethan never denied me. He just postponed me. And the dangerous thing about postponement is that it looks like kindness. One night, about 7 weeks in, I asked him a question I had been avoiding. What happens if your family decides I'm a liability? He didn't answer right away. He poured a drink, sat down across from me, looked genuinely uncomfortable. I don't think it'll come to that, he said. That wasn't an answer. I pressed a little more, not angrily, just calmly. And if it does? He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said, let's not borrow trouble. There's no reason to turn this into a confrontation. That word again? Confrontation. To Ethan, confrontation was always the worst possible outcome. Worse than resentment, worse than erosion, worse than someone quietly being diminished in the background. He believed that keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting people. But peace that only exists because one person keeps shrinking isn't peace. It's a delay. The more I watched him, the clearer it became. Ethan wasn't trapped between loyalty and love. He was balancing benefit and risk. With his family, he had status, security, a future already outlined. With me, he had intimacy, understanding, something that felt real. By staying in the middle, he didn't have to give either one up. And from the outside, that middle position looked reasonable, mature, diplomatic. But from where I was standing, it felt like standing alone while someone held both doors open and waited to see which one would close first. I don't think Ethan ever woke up intending to hurt me. I think he genuinely believed that if he stayed calm long enough, if he avoided hard decisions long enough, things would resolve themselves without costing him anything. What he didn't realize was that every time he chose not to act, someone else paid the price. And it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, a correction that didn't come. A silence that lingered too long, a reassurance that replaced a boundary. By the time I understood that pattern, it was already ingrained. Ethan wasn't choosing against me. He just wasn't choosing me. And sometimes, that's the most revealing choice of all. Because when things are easy, standing in the middle feels safe. It's only when the ground starts to shift that you realize the middle isn't neutral. It's strategic. And the longer I watched Ethan navigate that space, the more I understood something that would change how I saw everything that came next. People who refuse to choose sides aren't always confused. Sometimes they're simply waiting to see which side wins. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after that first dinner. Ethan had flown to Seattle for what he called a quick meeting, the kind of meeting that always seemed to land on a weekday and always seemed too complicated to explain. I stayed behind at the vineyard because Margaret insisted it would be nice for me to get to know the property. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like the land itself was a privilege I needed to earn. That afternoon, the house was quiet. The staff moved around like shadows, soft footsteps, doors closing carefully. No one lingered near me long enough to be remembered. And when you're treated like you're temporary, people stop guarding their words around you. I was in the study because it was the only room that didn't feel like a showroom. It smelled like leather and paper and old wine corks, the kind of room built for deals, not family. A folder sat on the corner of the desk, not hidden, not locked away, just left there. It had a clean label on the front, Q3 Expansion Legal. That should have been enough to tell me to walk away, but I've always had a weakness for patterns, for details that don't belong, for things that are too neatly organized to be casual. I told myself I was just moving it out of the way. I opened it. The first pages were boring, corporate structure, asset lists. a timeline that read like a textbook. But then, about 10 pages in, I saw a section title that made my stomach drop. Reputation risk. Personal attachments. Personal attachments. I kept reading. There was a line item about public-facing partnership optics, and beneath it, a paragraph outlining the importance of maintaining consistency with brand alignment. It was written in the kind of language that makes cruelty sound professional. And then I saw my name, not as a person, as a variable. Naomi Reed, non-aligned background, low brand value, potential liability during acquisition window. I read it twice, because part of me refused to accept that my life could be summarized like a spreadsheet. And then I saw Ethan's name right next to it. Ethan Caldwell, relationship management recommended. Maintain stability through announcement phase. Maintain stability. That's what I was to them. Stability. A buffer. A piece of furniture in a room they hadn't finished decorating yet. My hands went cold, but my mind went strangely clear, like something inside me had snapped into place. This wasn't a family being rude. This was a family running strategy. I flipped further. There were emails printed out, highlighted, the way people highlight things when they plan to use them later. There were notes in the margins, dates, meeting times, names of attorneys, names of firms, a small section about exit narrative with bullet points that sounded like a press release. And then I saw another phrase that felt like a slap. Temporary positioning until preferred alignment is secured. Preferred alignment. I didn't need a dictionary to understand what that meant. They had someone else in mind. Someone who fit. Someone who made the story look right. And I was the placeholder. I sat down in the chair because my legs stopped cooperating. I stared at the pages, and I kept thinking about Ethan's voice, calm, soothing, always telling me not to worry. Give it time. They'll come around. It'll work out. Work out for who? Because suddenly, every not the moment sounded less like caution and more like scheduling. I heard footsteps in the hallway and closed the folder fast, like I'd been caught stealing something that belonged to me, but no one came in. The footsteps passed, and the silence returned. That night, Ethan called me from his hotel. He sounded tired in that way people sound when they've been performing all day. "Hey," he said softly. How was everything? I could have confronted him right then. I could have asked him why my name was in a legal folder labeled like a risk factor. I could have demanded an explanation, but I didn't. Not because I was scared, because I wanted to know how deep the truth went. So I said, "It was fine. Your mom showed me the vines." He laughed, relieved. "See, it's getting better already. Getting better." I let the words sit between us. Then I asked, as casually as I could, what was the meeting about? There was a pause. "Just long enough?" "Nothing dramatic," he said. "Just planning. You know how they are. Planning." That was the moment I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider. Ethan wasn't clueless. He wasn't a victim of his family. He was an active participant in the fog. He didn't have to lie loudly. He just had to stay vague. And staying vague kept everyone comfortable. It kept his mother calm because she believed she could steer things. It kept me calm because I believed we were building something real. And it kept Ethan safe because as long as nothing was said clearly, nothing could be held against him. Here's the thing people get wrong about men like Ethan. They think a man who avoids conflict is harmless. They assume he's just gentle. Just overwhelmed, just stuck. But avoidance can be a strategy. It can be the easiest way to keep two doors open at the same time. I started replaying everything through this new lens. The way he corrected his mother in private, never in public. The way he asked me to be patient but never asked his family to be respectful. The way he promised a future without ever putting his name under a line that could be enforced. He wasn't choosing between love and loyalty. He was managing risk. And as long as I stayed quiet, he didn't have to pay the cost of choosing. That's what made it so hard to name. Because Ethan was never cruel enough to hate. He was simply careful enough to benefit. He got the warmth of my belief and the security of his family's approval. And the moment either side demanded clarity, he could always say, "You're overthinking." Like clarity was the problem, not the deception. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me, distant pipes, a door closing somewhere, wind against the glass. And I thought about something my grandmother used to say when I was a kid. When people don't think you matter, they stop locking the doors. The Caldwells didn't hide that folder because they couldn't imagine someone like me understanding it. They didn't think I was important enough to be cautious around. And Ethan, he didn't warn me, which meant one of two things. Either he didn't know what his family was doing, or he knew exactly what they were doing, and he was hoping I'd never find out. I didn't sleep much after that. Not because I was heartbroken, because heartbreak, at least, is honest. What I felt was something colder, a new kind of clarity. And once you see the structure underneath the kindness, you can't unsee it. By the time Ethan came home 2 days later, smiling like nothing had changed, I already understood the real question. Not whether his family would accept me, but whether Ethan ever planned to stand beside me when it actually mattered. And I was about to find out. 2 days after Ethan came back from Seattle, he kissed me at the kitchen counter like nothing had happened. He tasted like coffee and mint, and he wrapped his arms around me with the same easy familiarity he always had. Like the last few weeks were just a normal adjustment period. Like his mother's polite contempt and Lauren's sharpened smiles were background noise that would eventually fade. "Missed you," he said. I smiled back. I even said it too, because sometimes the safest place to hide a decision is behind normal life. That night, after everyone went to bed, I went back to the study. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I used the small desk lamp, the one that cast a warm circle on the wood and left the corners of the room in shadow. It felt fitting. I wasn't there to snoop. I was there to confirm. I had spent enough years working in systems to know this: the first document you find is never the whole story. It's the version people are comfortable leaving behind. The real truth is always buried in what connects to it: who signed, who forwarded, who edited, who benefited. So I started small. A corporate binder on the lower shelf, a printed org chart, a stack of shipping manifests in a tray labeled urgent. Nothing dramatic, just the everyday paper trail of a business that moved more than wine. And as I flipped through it, a familiar feeling crept in. That sensation you get when you're looking at something you've seen before, but it's wearing a different name. The terminology was changed. The logos were different. The formatting had been updated, but the structure was familiar. I paused on a page that listed third-party carriers and internal routing rules. It looked clean. It looked polished. It looked like someone had paid a lot of money to make it look simple. And that's when it clicked. 7 years ago. I had done contract work for a consulting firm that specialized in logistics optimization. I was younger then, hungry for experience, and I took the kind of projects you don't talk about at parties because no one thinks they're interesting. But I remembered the patterns, the way data flowed from distribution centers to reporting dashboards, the way exceptions were handled quietly off the main process, the way certain metrics were chosen because they made the company look stable, even if the real stability came from workarounds. I turned another page, and there it was. A phrasing I hadn't seen in years, a little line about how to reclassify delayed shipments to preserve quarterly performance indicators. It wasn't illegal on its face. It was just slippery. It was the kind of thing people do when they're more invested in appearances than truth. I sat back in the chair, staring at the paper. My heart wasn't racing. That part surprised me. I expected anger, betrayal, some dramatic emotional collapse. Instead, I felt something quieter, like a door closing. Because now I wasn't just the girlfriend being treated like a nuisance. I was someone who understood their machine. And when you understand the machine, you stop being impressed by the people who sit on top of it. Over the next week, I became very good at being invisible. I smiled at breakfast. I asked Margaret if she needed help setting the table, and she looked at me like she couldn't decide whether to be insulted or pleased. I complimented the wine selection at dinner, and Thomas nodded politely, grateful for anything that didn't create tension. I let Lauren believe I was harmless. I let Ethan believe I was okay. Because confrontation wasn't the goal, clarity was. Every day, I took little pieces, a brochure from a partner firm left on the printer, a calendar invitation accidentally sent to the wrong address, a vendor contract that was none of my business until it ended up on the counter beside the mail. And I didn't take them to expose anyone. Not yet. I took them to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. The more I gathered, the more obvious it became that the Caldwells weren't just planning an expansion. They were planning a narrative, a story they could tell investors, regulators, and the public, one that sounded clean, one that sounded inevitable, one that didn't include the messy parts. And I was one of those messy parts. I wasn't a person to them. I was a risk they wanted managed. One evening, Ethan and I sat on the back patio watching the sun drop behind the hills. The air smelled like damp soil and crushed leaves. He held a glass of wine and talked about the future like it was already written. "We'll travel more once this phase is over," he said. "Maybe buy a place in the city. Something simple. Something simple." I watched his face as he spoke. Calm, earnest, almost convincing. I asked him, quietly, "What exactly is this phase?" He smiled, like I'd asked a cute question. "Just business. Stress. You know." And there it was again. That gentle fog. The soft refusal to be specific. He leaned in and kissed my forehead. "Don't carry this. I've got it." But he didn't. He had the comfort of thinking he did. That's what people like Ethan mistake for strength. They think staying calm means they're in control. They think avoiding conflict means they're protecting everyone. They think ambiguity is a kindness. But ambiguity is also a shield. It protects the person using it more than it protects the person hearing it. So I kept my voice steady. I kept my face soft. I played my role. Not because I wanted to trick him, because I needed the truth to surface without resistance. There's a moment when you realize you've been reduced to a footnote in someone else's plan, where you have two choices. You can beg to be rewritten into the story, or you can step back and write your own. I chose the second. That week, I started building a map. Not a dramatic wall covered in photos and red string. A simple, logical map in my head. Who was connected to whom? Which company led to which partner? What dates mattered? What documents repeated the same language? What risk they were trying to bury under branding? And the more I mapped it, the more I realized something that made my stomach tighten. They weren't just preparing to end my relationship with Ethan. They were preparing to control how it ended. They wanted it clean, quiet, blameless. They wanted me to disappear in a way that didn't disrupt their timeline. And Ethan? Ethan would let it happen if it meant he didn't have to be the villain. He'd call it unfortunate. He'd call it complicated. He'd call it bad timing. That's the strange thing about people who refuse to choose. When the moment finally arrives, they still believe they can avoid responsibility by looking sad. But sadness isn't accountability. And I wasn't going to hand my dignity over to a plan written by people who didn't even think I was smart enough to read it. By the end of that week, I had enough pieces to see the outline. Not the full picture, not yet. But enough to know this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was architecture. And once you see the beams and the supports, you realize something else too. You don't have to smash the whole building to change the outcome. Sometimes, all it takes is removing one key support and letting the structure collapse under its own weight. The Caldwells thought I was staying quiet because I was intimidated. Ethan thought I was staying quiet because I was trusting him. The truth was simpler. I was staying quiet because I was preparing. And the next time they gathered everyone in one room to celebrate their success, I planned to be there. Not as a guest, as the person who finally understood what was really happening. And once I understood it, they were the ones who should have been afraid. The invitation arrived in an ivory envelope, thick enough to feel expensive before you even opened it. Margaret placed it on the breakfast table like she was handing me a privilege. Next Saturday, she said, "We're hosting the announcement here. It'll be good for you to see how things are done." How things are done. That was her favorite phrase when she wanted to remind me this wasn't my world. The event wasn't called an engagement party or a family celebration. It had a title that sounded like it belonged in a boardroom Caldwell Growth Initiative partnership announcement. There would be investors, county officials, a few reporters, the kinds of people who smiled without showing teeth. Ethan seemed excited in that measured way he always was, like he'd been trained never to look too emotional about anything. "It's a big deal." He told me that night. "Dad's been working on this for years." I asked him, softly, "And where do I fit into it?" He smiled and brushed my hair behind my ear. "You'll be there. With me." That sounded like reassurance. But it wasn't an answer. The week leading up to the event felt like living inside a museum while the exhibits were being rearranged around me. Staff polished wood floors until they shone. Tables were set and reset, like the placement of a napkin could shift the market. A catering team arrived with clipboards and headsets. A florist walked the property, pointing at corners of the patio like she was staging a photo shoot, not a gathering. Margaret supervised everything with the calm intensity of someone who believed perfection was a form of control. Lauren arrived 2 days early, gliding through the house like she owned it. Technically, she did. In her mind, it was never in question. She barely looked at me when she greeted Ethan. "Your speech is tight," she told him. "Don't ad-lib. People don't like surprises." Then she glanced at me. finally. And you, she said, smiling as if we were friends. Just be yourself. Quietly, quietly. That word landed like a hand on the back of my neck. The morning of the event. I woke up before sunrise, not because I was nervous, because my body had already decided this wasn't a normal day. I stood in the bathroom looking at myself in the mirror, the pale light making everything feel sharper. I didn't look dramatic. I didn't look like a woman about to blow up anyone's life. I looked like someone attending a party. That was the point. I chose a simple dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would give Margaret the satisfaction of thinking I was trying too hard. I wore my hair down, small earrings, clean makeup, not because I was trying to seem smaller, because I didn't want the story to become about my appearance. I wanted it to be about what was true. Ethan knocked on the door while I was fastening my bracelet. "You okay?" he asked. I turned and smiled. "I'm fine." He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. "Good. I want today to go smoothly. Smoothly." Another one of those words that sounded innocent until you realized what it really meant. It meant please don't make anyone uncomfortable. It meant please don't force me to choose. It meant please don't make me deal with consequences. Outside, the vineyard looked unreal. White tents had been set up between the rows of vines. There were string lights still unlit, waiting for sunset. A long table displayed bottles with custom labels, each one stamped with the Caldwell crest like the wine itself was part of their family legacy. Guests started arriving around noon. Black SUVs on the gravel drive. People in linen and sunglasses. Men who shook Ethan's hand a little too long. Women who hugged Margaret with careful enthusiasm, like affection was a business courtesy. They nodded at me politely, the way you nod at the assistant who brings you water, a few asked. "And you are?" Not because they didn't know my name, because they wanted to see how I would introduce myself. I said, "Naomi. Just Naomi." And I watched their eyes do the quick calculation. No last name offered, no title, no context. So I became exactly what they assumed I was: a girlfriend, a guest, an accessory, and that was perfect, because nobody guards their truth around an accessory. Thomas Caldwell greeted a county commissioner near the tasting table. Lauren stood close to a group of investors, laughing at things that weren't funny. Margaret floated between conversations, smooth and composed, her hand always lightly on someone's elbow like she was steering the whole room. Ethan stayed near me, but not too near, close enough to look supportive, far enough to stay flexible. At 3:00, the speeches began. A small stage had been set up under the tent, backed by a backdrop that read, "Caldwell Distribution Expanding What Matters." The irony of that phrase almost made me laugh. Thomas stepped up first. He spoke with that polished confidence people get when they've never had to doubt their own authority. He thanked the community. He talked about legacy. He mentioned responsible growth and local partnerships, like he was building something wholesome, not something strategic. Then Margaret took the microphone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I'm proud," she said, "that our family has always understood that success isn't just about profit. It's about alignment. It's about values. It's about surrounding yourself with the right people. The right people." She looked toward Ethan as she said it, smiling, and the crowd smiled back, because they heard what she meant without her having to say it. Lauren spoke next, sharper and quicker, laying out numbers like they were poetry. She mentioned timelines. She named the holding company. She thanked key legal partners and a compliance team in a way that sounded careful, like her words had been reviewed. I watched her. I watched the way she angled her body toward the reporters as she spoke. I watched the way she avoided saying certain names out loud, patterns. By the time Ethan stepped up, the air in the tent felt tight with self-congratulation. He looked good. He always did. He held the microphone like someone who knew people wanted him to succeed, like he'd been raised in rooms where confidence was expected. He started with a joke, a gentle one. Something about how the vineyard had taught him patience. People laughed. Then he got into the speech his family had approved. He talked about growth, about stability, about partnerships built on trust, and then, halfway through, he said something that made my stomach turn. "I'm grateful," he said, "for the people who support me personally, too, because none of this works without a strong foundation at home." He glanced at me just for a second, a soft smile, a pause long enough for the crowd to follow his gaze, and for the first time all day, I felt every eye land on me at once, not warmly, not curiously, like a spotlight that wasn't meant to illuminate you, only to check you. I smiled back, because that's what you do when you're being tested in public. Applause rose, polite and controlled. Ethan continued, voice steady. "We're entering a new chapter," he said. And I'm excited to do it the right way. The right way. There it was again. That phrase that sounded noble and meant nothing. When the speeches ended, the crowd flowed back into conversation like water returning to its channel. I stood near the edge of the tent, sipping sparkling water, watching the room the way I'd learned to watch systems. Who approached whom? Who avoided whom? Who seemed too relaxed because they believed everything was settled? Margaret walked over to me with a smile that finally looked real. "Good," she said softly. "You handled that well. Handled like I just passed an exam." Ethan came up behind her, putting a hand on my waist. "See," he murmured to me. "Smooth. Smooth." I looked at him and realized something that made everything inside me go still. He thought today was proof that things were improving. He thought my silence meant acceptance. He thought the applause meant approval. But what it really meant was that everyone had just revealed exactly how confident they were. They were celebrating, they were relaxed, they were certain. And when people are certain, they stop being careful. That's why the day they think they're winning is always the most dangerous day, because they don't see the person they underestimated standing right there, smiling politely, already holding the missing pieces. And as the sun started to dip behind the hills and the first string lights flickered on, I realized I wasn't waiting for a moment to explode. I was waiting for the moment the truth could no longer be contained, and it was closer than they thought. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to pause for a second, because I know what some of you are thinking. You've seen stories like this before: the rich family, the quiet girlfriend, the polite humiliation, the slow reveal, the moment everyone realizes they underestimated the wrong person. And if you're being honest, part of you is probably asking, why am I still watching? That question matters, because the reason isn't the plot. It's what the plot is doing for you. Most of us don't live in a world where we get clean endings. In real life, when someone disrespects you, there's rarely a microphone. There's rarely a room full of witnesses. There's rarely a perfect sentence you deliver that makes everyone fall silent. Most of the time, you just swallow it. You laugh it off to keep the peace. You shrink a little to avoid being called dramatic. You tell yourself it's not worth it, and then you go home and replay it in your head at 2 a.m, thinking of all the things you wish you'd said. So when you watch a story like this, you're not watching because you believe every detail is realistic. You're watching because it gives you something you don't get enough of in real life, a sense of order, a sense that disrespect has a cost, a sense that silence can be strategic, a sense that the person who was treated like nothing doesn't stay nothing forever. That's why these stories pull people in, even when they feel familiar. They don't just entertain you, they complete a sentence you never got to finish. And there's another reason you keep watching, even if you don't admit it out loud. Because the situation is relatable in a way that's almost embarrassing. Maybe it wasn't a vineyard. Maybe it wasn't a wealthy family. Maybe it was a workplace where people talked over you until someone else repeated your idea and suddenly it mattered. Maybe it was a relationship where you kept being patient while your needs stayed on hold. Maybe it was a family gathering where you were treated like an inconvenience until you did something impressive and suddenly everyone remembered your name. The setting changes, but the feeling is the same. That moment when you realize respect is being offered conditionally, not because of who you are, but because of what you can provide. And when you've felt that even once, you never forget it. That's why people argue in the comments about whether these stories are real or fake. Because what they're really arguing about isn't the facts. They're arguing about something deeper. They're asking, is it true that people will treat you better the moment they think you have value? And the uncomfortable answer is, yes. Sometimes, not always, but often enough that it leaves a mark. And the reason that stings is because it forces you to face a brutal reality. Some people don't see your humanity first. They see your usefulness. So when you watch someone like me walk into a room where I'm being measured and quietly dismissed, it hits a nerve because you recognize the test. You recognize the smiles that aren't really smiles. You recognize the questions that aren't really questions. You recognize the way people can insult you without raising their voice. And you also recognize the fantasy you wish you had access to. Not revenge, not chaos. Just a clean moment where the truth is undeniable. A moment where the system that protected them doesn't protect them anymore. A moment where the person who was underestimated is finally seen without having to beg to be seen. That's the real reason these stories hold you. They give you a kind of emotional justice. And whether you call it a trope or a pattern or the same story again, the reason it keeps working is simple. Because real life keeps giving people the same wound. Different faces, same wound. So if you're still here with me, it's not because you're naive, it's because you're paying attention. You're watching to see how the power shifts. You're watching to see what it costs. And maybe without even realizing it, you're watching to learn what you'd do if you were standing in that room. Because the truth is, the moment you've been underestimated enough times, you stop craving dramatic revenge. You start craving clarity. And that's exactly where this story is about to go. Because what happened after that announcement wasn't loud, it wasn't cinematic, it was something far more unsettling than that. It was the kind of consequence that doesn't require screaming to change everything. The first crack didn't come with a headline. It came 3 days after the announcement, in the form of an email that wasn't meant for me. It arrived late at night, forwarded accidentally by a junior coordinator who didn't realize my name was still on an internal distribution list. The subject line was dull. Something about clarifying reporting discrepancies. That's how these things always start. No drama, no accusation, Just a request for clarification. I opened it and read slowly, the way you do when you already know what you're going to find. A logistics partner had flagged inconsistent shipment classifications. Nothing explosive, just numbers that didn't line up with previous quarters. A few containers here, a delayed delivery there, enough to trigger a question. Not enough to cause panic. Yet. By morning, there were 2 more emails, one from legal, asking for documentation to support a reclassification decision, another from compliance, requesting a review of data access permissions. Still quiet, still contained. At breakfast, Margaret sipped her tea and talked about a luncheon she was planning. Lauren scrolled through her phone, thumbs moving fast, her smile a little tighter than usual. Ethan kissed my cheek and said, "Busy week ahead?" I nodded. By the end of that week, the questions had multiplied. What started as a routine audit expanded into a deeper review. Not because anyone suspected wrongdoing, but because once you pull on one thread in a system like theirs, it rarely comes loose alone. Processes overlapped, responsibilities blurred. Decisions had been approved verbally instead of documented. Access logs showed edits made at odd hours by accounts that no longer officially existed. Nothing illegal on its own, but together unstable. The kind of instability that makes investors nervous. That's when the tone changed. Margaret stopped floating through the house. She began closing doors, taking calls in the study, asking staff to give us privacy in a voice that suggested urgency without admitting it. Lauren canceled a dinner with friends she'd been talking about for weeks. She stayed up late, papers spread across the dining table, her confidence replaced by focus. Ethan noticed. He tried to act normal. He always did. But the calm he relied on started to fracture around the edges. One night, about 10 days after the announcement, he found me in the kitchen, staring out the window. "Things are complicated right now," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just temporary stress. Temporary... that word again?" I asked him, "What kind of stress?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Nothing you need to worry about." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something quietly devastating. This was the moment. Not the explosion, not the confrontation. This was the moment where he could have told the truth. Where he could have said, "I know more than I've told you." Where he could have stepped out of the fog. He didn't. And that told me everything. The following Monday, a formal notice arrived from one of the banks involved in the expansion. They were placing a temporary hold on funding until certain compliance questions were resolved. Temporary, but banks don't pause money unless they're preparing for the possibility of pulling it. The house felt different after that. Phones rang more often. Voices dropped lower. Conversations stopped when I entered the room, not because they were hiding something from me, but because they'd finally remembered I was there. That awareness came too late. The system was already shifting. Within days, legal counsel requested a full internal review, not because anyone had accused the Caldwells of fraud, but because the data they provided didn't align cleanly enough to satisfy risk assessment models. Models don't care about legacy. They don't care about intention. They care about consistency. And the Caldwell's system had been built on confidence, not consistency. That's what happens when people believe they're untouchable. They optimize for speed. They rely on relationships. They assume no one will look too closely until someone does. Ethan came to me that night with a look I hadn't seen before. Fear. Not panic. Not yet. But uncertainty. They're saying some things might need to be restructured, he said. It's probably nothing. Probably. He sat down across from me, elbows on the table, hands clasped together. I just need you to be patient, he added. I didn't respond right away, because patience had been my role for a long time, and patience was how we got here. Over the next 2 weeks, the Caldwell empire didn't collapse. It eroded. Partnerships asked for revisions. Timelines slipped. A reporter requested comment on a delayed filing. Lauren snapped at a staff member for misplacing a document. Margaret corrected her sharply in front of everyone. Thomas stopped pretending everything was under control. The certainty that once filled the house drained away, replaced by something brittle. Control is a strange thing. You don't realize you've lost it until you start trying to grab it back. One evening, Ethan confronted me not angrily, just desperately. Did you know any of this was coming? He asked. The question caught me off guard, not because it was unfair, but because it revealed how deeply he'd misunderstood me. I met his eyes and said, I knew the system wasn't as solid as they believed. That was the truth. He searched my face, like he was trying to decide whether to be relieved or afraid. You could have said something, he said. I nodded. So could you. The silence between us stretched. He looked away first. That was when I knew the choice had already been made. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. In the weeks that followed, the Caldwells lost more than money. They lost momentum. And momentum, once broken, is hard to rebuild. They were still wealthy, still connected, still respected in certain rooms, but the expansion, the future they had so carefully curated was gone. Not because of a scandal, because of scrutiny, because truth doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it just needs the right light. Ethan moved out shortly after. There was no fight, no betrayal scene, no raised voices, just a shared understanding that something essential had broken long before the system did. He tried to apologize. I listened. And for the first time, I didn't wait for reassurance, because by then, the story wasn't about winning. It was about seeing clearly, and clarity, once it arrives, doesn't leave room for illusions. The Caldwells never accused me of anything. They didn't have to. They knew, and I knew. And sometimes, that quiet knowing is the most complete ending of all. Because when the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't ask for permission. It simply rearranges everything around it and leaves you to deal with what's left. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, this part is for you. I'm not telling this next part as a story anymore. I'm telling it as a letter, quietly, slowly, the way I wish someone had told it to me. If you are in love with someone whose family treats marriage like a transaction, there are a few things you should understand early. Not to scare you, not to tell you to leave, just so you can see clearly. First, they will never call it a transaction. They'll call it legacy. They'll call it stability. They'll call it doing what's best for everyone. They'll smile when they say it. They'll invite you to dinners. They'll ask polite questions about your background, your parents, your plans, and at first, it will feel like curiosity. It isn't. It's due diligence. You'll notice it in the small things, in how conversations shift when finances come up, in how your relationship is discussed when you're not in the room, in how problems are framed as logistical, not emotional. They won't be cruel, not openly, because cruelty leaves evidence. Instead, they'll be reasonable, and reasonable people can justify almost anything. Second, your partner may not be the villain you want them to be. That's the hardest part. They might be kind, gentle, avoidant, the type who hates conflict and believes peace comes from patience. They'll tell you, "That's just how my family is." They'll say, "It doesn't mean anything." They'll promise you that once things settle down, everything will change, and they might believe it. But belief doesn't equal choice. When someone grows up inside a system like that, neutrality feels like safety. Standing in the middle feels responsible. They learn early that taking sides has consequences, and not taking sides has rewards. So when pressure comes, they default to balance. Not justice, not protection, balance. And balance, in families like that, always favors the system. Third, pay attention to when you are asked to be patient. Patience sounds like love. It sounds mature. It sounds like you're being trusted to handle things. But patience becomes dangerous when it only flows one way. If you are always the one waiting for approval, waiting for timing, waiting for clarity, ask yourself gently, what am I being asked to give up while I wait? Your voice, your security, your future. No one will ask you directly to sacrifice those things. They'll just keep postponing the moment when they matter. Fourth, understand this clearly. If a family sees marriage as a merger, they will always protect the company first. That doesn't mean they hate you. It means you are a variable. Variables can be adjusted, removed, replaced. That's not personal. That's how systems think. And if you ever find yourself being described as temporary, even indirectly, believe that description, not with anger, with awareness, because awareness gives you options. Fifth, do not confuse silence with peace. I stayed quiet for a long time because I thought silence meant strength. I thought not reacting meant I was above it. I thought understanding the system would somehow protect me from it. What silence really did was buy them time. Time to move pieces. Time to decide outcomes. Time to lock in advantages. Silence is only powerful when it's chosen from a position of clarity, when it's strategic, when it's paired with preparation. Silence used to survive is not silence. It's erosion. If you feel yourself shrinking to fit a space that keeps getting smaller, that's not compromise. That's warning. And finally, this is the part I wish someone had said out loud to me. Love does not require you to become negotiable. If you are constantly being measured, evaluated, compared, or delayed, that's not a test of your worth. That's a signal about the environment you're in. Healthy love doesn't ask you to disappear to keep the peace. Healthy love doesn't ask you to wait indefinitely for basic security. Healthy love doesn't treat your presence as a risk to be managed. You may still choose to stay. That's your decision. Life is complicated. Love is layered. Not every situation has a clean exit. But if you stay awake. Know what you're part of. Know what you're giving. Know what you're not willing to lose. And if you leave, don't tell yourself you failed. Sometimes leaving isn't about defeat. Sometimes it's about refusing to be reduced to a line item in someone else's plan. If this resonates with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear it quietly, the way I needed to, not as advice, as permission to see clearly